emotions give us information. And we talked before about how, having negative emotions can actually lead to feeling better about the positive emotions and all that good stuff. So I'd like to share an example of somebody that I've been working with recently who was not using emotions to give her the information that she could have been, getting. So this is a girl who's, I think, approaching 30, has been overweight her entire adult life. I've been working with her to try to help her to lose weight, commit to going to the gym, commit to sort of a healthier lifestyle. And she was working with a trainer and working with all these people who were giving her all of the information and knowledge that she needed to make those correct decisions, right? So we had to get to the point where she was committed to sort of doing that for herself and sort of started making herself a priority. And we got to the point where she could ask herself, faced with a decision like, should I go to the gym or should I not? Which of these outcomes is going to be the best for me, right? So we got her to sort of ask herself that question. Sometimes she would make the healthier decision, sometimes she would not. And none of us are going to be perfect, we're never going to do that 100% of the time. But she wasn't making that decision a high enough percentage of the time to be achieving the goal that she wanted, right? And so we would be talking about that, and she's like, I know when I'm making a bad decision or a good decision, I get that intellectually. And so I asked her, how do you feel afterwards? And she's like, the only words that she could use were good and bad. I either felt good if I made a good decision or I felt bad. But she didn't really allow herself to sort of experience those emotions or label them more specifically. Once we could get to the point where, okay, I made this decision and now I feel disappointed. And now I feel a little bit disappointed if I make this one decision, and I feel a lot disappointed if I make this other decision. Once she could sort of be more categorical with her emotions, she started getting the feedback that she needed. Because once you experience a positive emotion, we're creatures of habit. If we do something and it feels good, we're going to want to do it again, right? She was robbing herself of that feedback because she didn't want to experience the negative emotions. She had been making poor decisions for herself for so long, it was overwhelming to feel that negative emotion over and over again. She was then robbing herself of feeling that positive emotion, which was then reinforcing to do that thing over and over again. But I literally created a chart for her where she had to write down the decision that she made and how she felt afterwards. And once she started doing that, she started recognizing and experiencing those emotions, and it became the feedback that she needed to start making those decisions more often than she had been before. So I just like to use that as an example of a way that if we don't allow ourselves to experience the good and the bad, we rob ourselves of that information to make those good decisions moving forward. Alright, so we're going to talk about emotion. Do we think that there are any situations that would cause a universal reaction? So is there anything that could possibly happen that everybody would have the same emotional reaction to?
Natural disaster.
Okay.
No. I don't
So
think
let's...
so.
Cheater.
No,
So we'll
because
start
with
with...
a natural disaster. If you look at it from a religious aspect, two religions are fighting, and all of a sudden, the one religion gets hit with a natural disaster. Well, the other people are joyous, and
Right.
that causes a different emotion than the ones that got hit by the natural disaster.
Right. So you totally cheated and jumped ahead. But usually things like death, right? Because most people are going to be like, well, yeah, death equals sad, right? Natural disaster, sometimes there's death and destruction with natural disaster, right? So now we're talking about sad. Anything else that would generally come to mind when we think of, a universal response or universal emotion? What about birthdays? Everybody likes their birthday, right?
At a certain age.
Everybody who's coming up to a 30.
Right. But we start out really liking our birthday, right? It's only once we get older and we start incorporating some outside information about what birthdays are and what they mean and existential meaning and all that stuff that maybe birthdays aren't quite as happy anymore, especially when you hit certain, milestone numbers. But, talk about milestones. A 16th birthday, generally happier. A 21st birthday, generally happier. I mean, my grandma's approaching 98. She said the only birthday that ever bothered her was 25. There was something about being a quarter of a century that made her feel really old, and now she doesn't feel that old. I mean, I don't know. I don't get it. Maybe I'll figure it out in 60 to 70 years. But there's really nothing that happens that causes sort of a universal reaction. So what does that then mean? How many times do we feel like something happens and our emotion is just an automatic response? It just happens in a blink of an eye, right? That happens to us sometimes. Is there something that's happening in between that event and our emotion? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there is. Now, the question is, what is that thing that's happening in between?
How you're interpreting it.
Right. How you're interpreting that event. Because that birthday, it's all about how we interpret that birthday, right? That death, it's all about how we interpret that death. Even the death of a loved one, what if that loved one had, my grandfather died after battling Alzheimer's for 10 years. So was I happy to see him go? Absolutely not. But could there be a feeling of relief in there? Hope that maybe he's in a better place. He's not suffering anymore. There can be additional emotions. And that's another thing to keep in mind too. It's very unlikely that we're only going to experience a single emotion given any event. A lot of times we get stuck focusing on whatever the most extreme one is. And if we're in sort of a negative place, we focus on whichever the most extreme negative emotion is. Now you had brought up the idea of guilt before, right? So, can you imagine a situation where a close loved one dies after maybe a long terminal illness, and there's a little part of you that feels relieved, right? And then we feel guilty that we feel relieved. Or maybe after a couple of months, we realize we're not thinking about that person every single minute of the day anymore. We sort of went about a normal day, and we didn't, that wasn't on our mind the entire time. Now we feel a little bit guilty, like we're doing some disservice, right? Guilt is okay in really, really tiny increments. It gives us feedback that maybe we're doing something wrong. Sometimes that can be true. When we put guilt on things that we don't need to put them on, we're really just adding unnecessary stress. And again, we're going to talk about a couple specific examples where that may happen. Okay, everybody believe me that there's no such thing as a universal reaction to a given event? Okay. Alright, so we are going to spend the majority of the rest of our time practicing the very thing that you can take with you and practice on your own so that you can sort of learn to manage those emotions as they happen. So we're going to cover sort of the ABC model of emotions. So, A stands for our activating event, which is just a really fancy way of saying it's the thing that either happened or is happening. It's the traffic that we experience, it's the death we experience, it's the presentation that's upcoming, it's the money trouble that we're having, it's, getting laid off of a job at work. It's whatever is happening sort of outside of us that we don't necessarily have control over, right? So if we think back to the picture that I drew, it's the water coming out of the pipe that we don't necessarily have a way to control. It's happening to us, and that's just sort of it, right? We jump over here to the C, which is the emotional consequence. Again, just a really fancy way of saying it's the way we feel regarding that particular event. The B is your belief, the thought that intermediates between the thing that happens and the emotional consequence. A lot of times we forget that the way that we're feeling is directly related to the thing that we're thinking about the event. Once we start to remember that, we can then start thinking additional things that are going to lead to additional feelings. So let's start with traffic. We're going to start with sort of a generic one, but then I'm going to want some specific examples. So traffic on the way to, maybe on the way to getting to work, right? Most likely, our first feeling is going to be frustration. So if I'm experiencing traffic on the way to work and I feel frustration, what is the thing that I'm probably thinking that's going to lead to that frustration? It's certainly not, yay, I'm not at work. So what is the thing that you're thinking that leads to the frustration?
I'm going to be late.
I'm going to be late. And that there's some negative consequence of being late, right? So I'm going to be late. Okay? Can somebody have a different reaction or think a different thing about experiencing traffic on the way to work?
I always wonder why I picked the wrong lane.
Okay.
Choice.
Why am I always in the wrong?
Because you then move over to the lane that's moving, right?
But then it stops.
And then it stops.
And then the other one goes.
And the other one goes, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's not the only way. Because, right, like, I generally run late to things. Usually I get there on time or close to it. But I'm going to start getting frustrated at the traffic, right? But then I'm going to start blaming all of the other cars for being in my way. It is their fault that they're going the same way at the same time that I'm going. I don't want to admit I left my house 15 minutes late. Because then I have to blame myself, and that's an emotional consequence I don't want to experience, right? So for me, the frustration of blaming all of the other cars, it's a safer feeling. Now, does that mean it's the best possible way to interpret that? Not at all. And a lot of times we don't do it necessarily the best way, but we do it in somewhat of a more self-serving way. I'm not going to blame myself for being late, because you know what? Even though I left late, if everybody else would just get out of my way, I'd be fine, right? If people realize that when they get into an accident, it affects my life, I would be so much happier because they would drive more carefully and then it wouldn't happen and I wouldn't have to go around them and it would be great. It doesn't always happen. Is it possible to experience traffic on the way to work and you're going to be late, but still have it be somewhat of a positive experience? Or we can think something positive about that. What if you don't really want to be at work anyway?
Right.
I mean, that's sort of an obvious one, right?
Playing it.
Right?
A few
So,
extra minutes with an extra audiobook.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then
Right.
listen to your music.
Yeah.
I love my car. I should have left earlier, so it is what it is.
right. And, I mean, of course, none of us text while driving, right? We're never going to do that. But some of us might make phone calls while driving, right? Just an opportunity to catch up with some people. The audiobook is a good one. If you're not really that intent on getting to the place you're going anyway, big deal, right? Maybe it's not work you're heading to, maybe it's some family event or friend event and you're going to make an appearance, but if you're not there the entire time, big deal, right? So traffic can be really frustrating, but if we start thinking about some of those other more positive outcomes, we can begin to feel a little bit differently, and we can be simultaneously frustrated and a little bit relieved as well. We can feel some of those other things, right? So,